The rain in Seattle has a way of blurring the lines between reality and reflection, but that afternoon, everything felt razor-sharp. My name is Elias, and for a decade, I've been the backbone of my family's digital life, the one who managed the accounts, the security, and the legacy. I worked as a senior systems architect, a job that requires a level of patience my family always mistook for weakness. I was standing in the den of our family home, the scent of cedar and expensive coffee lingering in the air, having just told my younger brother, Julian, that I wouldn't co-sign for his third failed luxury streetwear line. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me with a cold, glassy stare that I should have recognized as a warning. The sound of the impact wasn't loud, but it was final. A dull thud followed by the crystalline crunch of something expensive meeting the floor. "Sorry, your iPhone 17 is broken," Julian said, his voice as smooth as the silk shirt he was wearing, a shirt I had probably paid for. He stepped over the mangled device, his boot catching the edge of the titanium frame. He hadn't just dropped it. He had pinned it against the corner of the marble hearth and applied enough pressure to twist the motherboard. I didn't move. I didn't even look down. I asked him why he felt entitled to touch my property, and he gave a small, airy shrug. He said it was a misunderstanding of space, a phrase he'd learned from one of his high-priced therapists. My mother, Clara, floated into the room, her voice a practiced melody of avoidance. She didn't look at the $1,200 wreckage on the floor. She looked at me, her eyes already demanding that I be the bigger person. She told me that Julian was emotionally volatile today and that I shouldn't provoke him over a piece of plastic. She didn't ask what had led to the moment. She didn't look at the way my hands were shoved into my pockets, fingers curling into fists. To her, my property was a sacrificial lamb for Julian's ego. I stayed silent, and in that quiet, I felt a gear shift deep inside my mind. They thought I would absorb the loss like I always did. But as the rain tapped against the window, I realized Julian had just handed me the perfect reason to sever the tether. If you were standing there, watching your hard-earned life literally being stepped on while your own mother told you to smile, what would your next move be? Returning to my apartment felt like entering a different world. I set the broken phone on my workstation and sat down, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my glasses. For years, I had ignored the family cloud logs, treating them as a chore I'd get to eventually. But with the physical device gone, I had to initiate an emergency hardware bypass from my main server. As the data started to sync, the reality of Julian's streetwear lifestyle began to emerge in the code. It wasn't just that he was borrowing money. He had turned my entire digital infrastructure into a laundering system for his personal debts. The first anomaly was a series of API calls from an unrecognized device in the suburbs. Julian had used my developer credentials, which were stored on the shared family keychain, to authorize a third-party payment gateway for his brand. Snorts, except it wasn't for a brand. He had been routing high-interest predatory loans through my name, using my credit score as a shield. Every time he needed to check an email on my phone, he was actually approving a new line of credit. My chest tightened as I saw the total, nearly $40,000 in pending liabilities, all linked to my primary identity. I called my colleague and longtime friend, Sarah, who specialized in forensic accounting. I needed a second pair of eyes that didn't have the bias of family loyalty. As I walked her through the logs, her voice through the speakers was sharp. "Elias, this isn't just sibling rivalry. He's built a ghost identity on top of yours. If that phone hadn't broken and triggered the hardware security alert, you wouldn't have seen these authorizations for another 6 months. By then, your credit would have been a crater." The realization stripped away the last of my hesitation. My brother hadn't just broken a phone. He had tried to bury me in his failures while smiling to my face. I opened a dedicated encrypted file. I started listing every timestamp, every unauthorized IP address, and every forged signature. I noticed Mom's fingerprints on it too, literally. She had used her emergency access to my cloud storage to upload her own medical bills, which were being paid out of a sub-account I had set up for my future kids' college fund. They weren't just leaning on me. They were dismantling my future to maintain their present. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made the emotional weight vanish. It was no longer a family problem. It was a security breach. Subscribe for more stories like this, because this was the moment I stopped being the backup plan. By 2 a.m., the apartment was a tomb of silence, save for the clicking of my mechanical keyboard. It was time for the quiet move. I didn't send a warning text. I didn't leave a voicemail for Mom to cry over. I went into the root directory of the family trust one managed. My father had left me in charge of the digital keys for a reason. He knew Julian couldn't handle the responsibility. I initiated a security reset. One by one, I revoked the administrative privileges of every user except myself. I changed the encryption protocols on the family's private server, moving 20 years of documents, tax records, and inheritance blueprints into a cold storage vault that required a physical hardware key, the one Julian had just smashed. Next, I looked at the legacy account. This was a shared fund intended for the maintenance of our family's summer home in the Cascades. Julian had been using the property as a content house for his brand without paying a dime. I contacted the property management firm. I informed them that as the primary trustee, I was suspending all guest access and changing the smart locks effective immediately. I also revoked the lease guarantee I had signed for Julian's trendy downtown apartment. I cited suspicion of identity fraud as the reason for the withdrawal, a move that would trigger an automatic investigation by his landlord. I then moved to the most sensitive part, the social reputation. Julian's brand relied entirely on a verified Instagram and TikTok account that were, technically, sub-profiles of my business manager account. I had set them up that way to give him professional-grade analytics. I didn't delete them. That would be too loud. Instead, I changed the primary contact to my lawyer's email and placed the accounts in audit mode. This would hide his posts from the public while we verified the source of funding. In an instant, his audience of 50,000 followers saw nothing but a blank under review page. I drafted a single, one-sentence email to Julian and my mother. All unauthorized access points have been secured. Please direct all future financial or digital inquiries to my legal counsel. I sent it and shut down my computer. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying their weight. I was standing on solid ground, and they were the ones floating in the void. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had to cut a golden family member off to save your own sanity? The next morning, I arrived at my office in downtown Seattle. I was barely through my first cup of coffee when the security desk called. My mother and Julian were in the lobby, and they weren't taking no for an answer. I walked out to meet them, not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted them to see exactly where the boundaries now stood. Julian looked frantic. His usual composed, streetwear mogul persona was gone, replaced by the shaky energy of a man whose world had just vanished. He was holding his iPad, staring at the account-locked screen. "What did you do to my brand, Elias?" Julian hissed, ignoring the curious glances from the tech teams passing by. "My followers think I've been hacked. I have a launch in 2 days." My mother stepped forward, her voice a sharp, brittle whisper. "Elias, honey, this is cruel. Your brother is in tears. You've locked him out of his own home. His landlord just sent a notice that he needs to vacate because his financial backer flagged him for fraud. How could you do that to your own blood?" She still had that look, the one that said I was the villain for reacting to their betrayal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look angry. I looked at Julian and told him that his brand was built on my credit and my credentials, and since he felt comfortable destroying my property, I felt comfortable reclaiming mine. Julian stepped closer, his face turning a dark shade of red. "You're just a bitter tech nerd. You think because you have the keys, you're God? Give me my access back now, or I'll tell everyone you're embezzling from the family trust." It was a desperate, stupid threat. Sarah, my friend from the forensic team, stepped out of the elevator. She wasn't there to support me. She was there to hand me a physical file. "The internal audit is complete, Elias," she said loudly enough for Julian to hear. "We've documented $42,000 in unauthorized transfers to Julian's accounts. The board has been notified of the identity breach." Julian froze. He hadn't realized that my quiet moves had a professional paper trail. Mom's jaw dropped. She looked at Julian, then at me, then back at Julian. The softness in her eyes was finally starting to crack. "Please leave," I said, as two security guards moved into position behind me. "The next time we speak, it will be in the presence of an arbitrator. And Julian, don't worry about the phone. I'll be sending you the bill for the $40,000 you took, plus interest." As they were escorted out, Julian yelled something about betraying the family, but it sounded hollow. He wasn't a mogul. He wasn't a victim. He was just a guy with a broken phone and a mountain of debt. 48 hours later, the digital eviction had turned into a full-scale professional collapse for Julian. Because his social media accounts were in audit mode, his sponsors, brands that had given him thousands in clothing and equipment, began to pull their contracts. To them, an under-review status on a verified account usually meant one thing: fraudulent activity. Julian couldn't answer their emails because his professional domain was hosted on my server, which was now in hard lockdown. He was effectively a ghost in the industry he had spent 3 years trying to conquer. By midweek, the situation turned from professional to personal. Julian had to move his entire luxury stock out of his apartment and into my mother's garage. He didn't have a car. The lease was tied to the same family account I had frozen. I heard through my aunt that he was taking the bus to meet with a public defender, trying to see if he could sue me for damages. But every lawyer he spoke to told him the same thing. If the accounts are in Elias's name and paid for by Elias's bank, Elias has the absolute right to revoke access. Julian was learning that family sharing wasn't a legal deed of ownership. My mother tried to call me 50 times in one day. I didn't answer. I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to forgive and forget so the noise would stop. She wanted her quiet, peaceful life back, even if it meant I had to pay for Julian's sins. I finally sent her a single text. "If you keep calling, I will move the medical bill audit to the legal department. Stop being his accomplice." The calls stopped instantly. For the first time in her life, Clara realized that my patience wasn't a bottomless well. She was finally afraid of the son she had ignored. I spent that Friday at a quiet cabin in the woods, far from the reach of Seattle's rain and my family's drama. Sarah called me to let me know that Julian had tried to social engineer his way back into the server by calling the hosting provider and pretending to be me. But because I had set up a vocal biometric requirement months ago, just in case, the system had flagged his voice as a mismatch and permanently blacklisted his IP address. He had tried to break back into the fortress, and all he did was lock the doors even tighter. He thought he could manipulate the machine as easily as he manipulated people. He was wrong. The machine only follows the code, and the code was mine. By the end of the month, the fallout reached its most painful point, not for Julian, but for my mother. Because she had been using the college fund account to pay her personal bills, and because I had frozen that account as part of the identity theft audit, her credit cards began to decline. She had built a life on a foundation of my silent labor, and when that foundation moved, her entire world tilted. She had to sell her jewelry just to cover the property taxes on the family home. It was a brutal realization for her. The stable son was the only thing standing between her and financial ruin, and she had traded him for the exciting son who had destroyed his own sister's property. She sent me a letter, a real, physical letter on heavy stationery. It wasn't full of anger this time. It was full of a desperate, clawing grief. She admitted that she knew Julian was troubled, but that she thought I was strong enough to handle it. She essentially admitted that she had used me as a human shield for Julian's incompetence. I read the letter twice, Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I burned it. I didn't need her confession. I already had the data. I realized that my family hadn't been a unit, they had been a consumption cycle, and I was the fuel. Julian, meanwhile, was living in the basement of a distant relative's house. He had been forced to take a job at a local shipping warehouse, moving boxes for $12 an hour. It was a far cry from the front rows of fashion weeks. I saw a picture of him on a cousin's Facebook. He looked tired, his expensive clothes stained with sweat and dust. He was finally learning the weight of a dollar, and it was crushing him. He still hadn't apologized for the phone. In his mind, he was still the victim of my power trip. I realized then that an apology would never come, because that would require him to admit he was just an ordinary man. And to Julian, being ordinary was a fate worse than being a thief. I finalized the inheritance restructure. I moved my father's remaining assets into a trust that Julian couldn't touch until he was 55 years old. If he wanted to live like a king, he would have to wait 30 years, or build his own kingdom. Subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing the game. The Seattle rain felt different now, no longer a blur, but a cleansing. I stood on the balcony of my new office, looking out at the Puget Sound. It had been 60 days since the afternoon Julian smashed my phone. In that time, I had lost a brother and a mother, but I had reclaimed my life. My credit score was recovering, the predatory loans were being contested in court with a 90% success rate, and my professional reputation had never been higher. My firm had promoted me to head of global security, a role that recognized the very decisiveness my family called cruelty. I saw Sarah in the hallway, and we shared a quiet nod. No drama, no rescue missions. Just the mutual respect of two people who understood that boundaries are the only thing that keeps the world from descending into chaos. Julian was still in the basement, still moving boxes, still telling anyone who would listen that his big break was just around the corner. He was a ghost of a life that never existed. My mother was living in a smaller apartment, learning to check the prices of groceries for the first time in 30 years. I learned that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of control. I had spent 30 years letting my family define my role, but in one afternoon, I had rewritten the script. I was no longer the responsible one who cleaned up the mess. I was the one who ensured there was no mess to clean. I looked at my new phone, the screen smooth and unbroken. It was just a device, but it was also a reminder. People will treat you exactly how you allow them to. And once you stop allowing the accidents, you realize how much of your life was actually a choice. I sat down at my desk and opened a new project. For the first time in a decade, my mind was completely clear. He thought it was just a phone, but it was the moment everything changed. The room around me is silent now, but for the first time in 30 years, that silence doesn't feel like a heavy weight. It doesn't feel like the quiet before the storm or the suffocating tension of waiting for Julian's next crisis to land on my desk. It feels like a clean slate. I spent a lifetime believing that being the strong one meant absorbing the blows, paying the bills, and keeping the peace at the cost of my own soul. I thought my value was measured by how much of my family's chaos I could carry without collapsing. But looking back at that shattered phone on the marble hearth, I realized that wasn't strength. It was permission. Every time I said, "It's okay," I was telling Julian that my boundaries were optional. Every time I covered a debt or ignored a forged signature, I was telling my mother that her favoritism had no price tag. That broken piece of titanium was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. It was the sound of a cycle finally snapping. I know some people watching this will call me cold. They'll say that blood is thicker than water, and that families should be forgiven no matter the cost. But I've learned that blood is just biology. Loyalty is something earned through respect, and love isn't a license to steal your future. If I had stayed, if I had forgiven and forgotten one more time, I wouldn't be the hero of this story. I'd be the accomplice to my own destruction. Julian is in a basement now, finally learning the weight of a shovel and the value of a single dollar. My mother is in a small apartment, finally learning the price of the lifestyle she expected me to fund. It sounds harsh, but reality is the only teacher they ever truly needed. By stepping away, I didn't just save my bank account. I gave them the only chance they ever had to become adults. I stopped being the safety net that allowed them to fall without learning how to stand. So, as we close this chapter, I have to ask you, the person sitting there watching this right now, where do you draw your line? Maybe it isn't a shattered phone for you. Maybe it's a constant borrowing of your time, a subtle dismissal of your dreams, or a family member who only calls when the bank account is empty. Maybe it's a parent who expects you to set your own life on fire just to keep them warm. How much of your life are you currently sacrificing to keep someone else's world from spinning out of control? I want to hear your stories. Have you ever had to be the villain in your family's narrative just to protect your own sanity? Have you ever made a quiet move that changed everything? Go down to the comments and let's talk. I read every single one of them, and honestly, seeing how many of you have walked the same path is what keeps this channel going. We aren't just telling stories here. We're reclaiming our boundaries together. We are proving that you can walk away and still be whole. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you even a second of clarity about a situation in your own life, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. And if you're new here, if you want more deep dives into the psychological reality of high-stakes drama and digital revenge, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We have some incredible, raw narratives coming up that you won't want to miss. Before you go, if you enjoyed how I handled the digital audit in this story, you need to check out this video right here. It's a story about a hidden inheritance and the one digital trail that changed a family's legacy forever. You'll see exactly what happens when the quiet one finally speaks up. Take care of yourselves. Because if you don't set the rules for your life, someone else will always try to write them for you. I'm Elias. This was my quiet move. And I'll see you in the next one.